Hi, I'm James Verdeer, and welcome to the American Institute of Biological Sciences BioScience Talks, which is a forum for integrating the life sciences. On the second Wednesday of each month, and sometimes in between, we discuss the latest bioscience publications. And as a reminder, if you'd like to read more, point your browser to academic.oup.com/bioscience. Today's episode is the next in our In Their Own Words oral history series, in which we talk with scientists who have made great contributions to their fields. This week's guest is Dr. Alan Covich, professor of ecology at the Odum School of Ecology at the University of Georgia in Athens. Let's go to the interview. Dr. Covich, thank you very much for joining me today.
Oh, I'm glad to have the opportunity to talk with you and find out more about how AIBS is developing the future.
Well, thank you. And so our first question is, when did you first know that you wanted to work in the life sciences?
Well, I think I've always, as a kid growing up, enjoyed being outdoors, camping, canoeing. I didn't think of it as a profession or a career at that point in high school, certainly. But I think I was just extremely lucky to find the right mentors at the right time in my life to give me some guidance, because I really was interested in just about everything. I was one of those students who I changed my major 4 times my first 2 years at the university, Washington University. And I know my family was beginning to worry that I would never know what I wanted to do, but I had great teachers, and each time I took a course in something that they really inspired me, I just wanted to do that. And so I ended up with a pretty diverse perspective on science in general. I think interested also in the connections between the social sciences and the natural sciences, especially economics. I ended up minoring in economics and majoring in botany. And I was just extremely fortunate, I think, in having some work experience in people's laboratories. So I was doing all kinds of things. Mostly, I had a half tuition scholarship at Washington University, and during the other half, I was doing everything from washing dishes in somebody's lab to going to the slaughterhouse to get calf's liver on an ice bucket and take it into the cold room and spend the afternoon extracting mitochondria for a microbiologist and raising wonderful plants in the greenhouse for tobacco mosaic virus research, and sort of listening in to what scientists were talking about. They would be having coffee and seeing that science is people, and biology is so diverse. I was still very unclear what I wanted to do, but the thing that made all the difference was field work and getting out and taking my initial kind of excitement about just being outdoors into something that actually had an intellectual application. So that was a great discovery. And I think I was able to go on field trips in the summer with Robert Woodson, who was a professor of botany at Washington U. He was studying the evolution of Asclepias tuberosa and had a transect across the entire country looking at the evolution of flower color. So for 2 summers, along with some grad students, I was an undergrad, but I went with them collecting plants at high speed, 60 mile an hour along highways, pulling off every time we'd spot one in flower. And that was exciting. I got to see the country, but I also got to learn a lot about evolution. And then I was very lucky in working at the Missouri Botanical Garden with Hugh Cutler, who was an ethnobotanist interested in the evolution of corn, looking at fossil corn cobs, little tiny things that really were the earliest kind of domesticated corn that indigenous people were using to get popcorn. And archaeologists were pulling these out of different strata. And Cutler was looking at the evolution along with Edgar Anderson, who was a geneticist looking at the evolution of maize. And that combination of research and intellectual curiosity, I think, was what did it. But in the summers, being able to get into the field really mattered. And so then in college, I was able to go to the tropics for the first time with 2 of the faculty, the 2 actually who taught my first introductory ecology course, Norton Nickerson and Owen Sexton. And that trip to Darien, Panama, a month long, going up the Chuquenaki River and seeing the largest trees I ever could imagine. In fact, just unbelievable diversity of plants and animals and people. The indigenous people living along the river were just incredibly fascinating and well adapted to making a living in ways that I had no idea about. So getting into anthropology and into cultural kind of things was just kind of a natural process of what liberal education was all about in the 60s. And I was just extremely lucky. I spent a month on Barra, Colorado Island, on the island in Gatun Lake in the Panama Canal, doing some studies there. And ever since, I've just been excited about the tropics. So I think the idea of field work and experiencing things firsthand is just so important. That's why this age of the pandemic and having people get outside, but in small groups, is still really important. And I guess has been probably forever.
Yeah, I would imagine looking at it in that perspective, this has to be something that's a major priority for you in your teaching, in this semester and the coming semesters is finding ways to ensure that students are still able to have those types of experiences that were of great formative value to you. What's that experience been like of trying to maintain that?
Well, I think it's been an age of discovery since March, but indeed we have made some real progress. I think, and I think the students are really learning a lot in some new ways, and certainly as somebody trying to be an effective mentor, I'm learning a lot about how to foster that in some really exciting ways. But I always get back to telling them that once this is over, you're going to need to have a lot of hands-on experience, and so don't wait. Turn off your computer, get outside, do direct observations like people have done ever since they started thinking about nature, and sort of invent your own field work, your own direct observation, whether it's birds, butterflies, crayfish, whatever. Get out there with close friends or whoever you can talk into doing some work safely, and experience nature directly. And I strongly encourage people to look both day and night, because some of the most exciting field work I've ever done is at night. And I'm convinced now that there are two different kinds of ecosystems, one during the day and one during the night, because species are so adapted to these kinds of differences. Whether you're a plant or an animal, when you're pollinated or when you're feeding or when you're hiding, is so different from day and night, and that's hard to capture online. So you really got to get out there, and I think people are doing it, and of course they have for generations, and so it's just a matter now reminding people that yes, this is a different time, but it's not that different from what we've been able to adapt for since the beginning. So I think it's working, but I don't know. It is a challenge, and it's not nearly as much fun as face to face in small groups or a large auditorium. I've been teaching now for 50 years. I mean, I started my last year in graduate school at Yale, teaching the introductory ecology course to the undergrads, and loved it, and never want to stop. But I think that from the standpoint of what you see is that students' eyes open to things that they just never thought about before, whether it was looking down a microscope or looking at a scanning electron micrographs for the first time in a different way, in a way with context, in a way that shows a deeper appreciation for biodiversity and aspects of how things actually work, rather than just aha, that's beautiful, it's interesting, but how does it work? How does it function? What's its value in terms of society? These are all issues I think that a good college preparation helps you do. And it certainly starts, in grade school and certainly in high school. And I think with parents, I mean, my mom, as a single mom, she was really interested in making sure that I got to Audubon Society meetings and got outside and did things. And my brother and I were always encouraged to go to camp every summer. So it seemed to me that there is this early phase of parental guidance, and then getting lucky. Serendipity is just, I think so important. I think the only thing that I've managed to really learn is that persistence and serendipity is a strong combination for learning about new things. And if you can develop curiosity about nature, You're going to have fun, you're going to enjoy it, and you're going to come up with something new that people haven't seen before or interpreted in some new way. So that's why I still enjoy teaching, no matter how it is, online or face to face. It's still exciting.
Absolutely. And speaking of serendipity, perhaps a little bit, what would you say is the biggest surprise of your career so far?
I think the biggest surprise is how much I learned in the last 30 years being part of the long-term ecological research program in the Quillo Mountains in Puerto Rico. I think traditionally, ecologists worked in small groups. You know, they had a lab, had some of their own students, undergrads and graduate students, and maybe one or two other colleagues. But I think what the National Science Foundation has done in terms of developing the long-term ecological research program and creating big science, team science, really changing the culture of how we approach problems and thinking about timescales that are decadal long, not just in the period of a few years of a student's research program, either as an undergraduate or a graduate student, or as a faculty member, but sort of multi-generational kinds of consideration. And seeing how those teams develop has been really impressive, and seeing the results that come out and the surprises that keep happening. I mean, we started in 1987 thinking about the effects of hurricanes on tropical rainforest, and we've had four of those since that time. And but we also had two droughts, and we weren't expecting droughts in a rainforest, and it turns out that certainly extremely important. But gathering data for one kind of thing allows you to be ready for some surprise and to be able to interpret things that you just didn't expect to happen. So I think serendipity is just amazing for generating more curiosity and more innovation and the need for more techniques and technology. And LTR has been great about doing that. I think NEON is the next thing for the next 30 years. I know the AIBS played a major role in that when I was president, in terms of getting workshops organized and getting town meetings and getting the biological community to think about how to do continental scale research. Rita Colwell, then as director of NSF, was just amazingly effective in helping getting that started and building on her earlier program on biocomplexity, which was sort of intellectually the precursor for all these kinds of recognition of the need for long-term data. And now the big data is so available, and there's so much of it coming, and things are really happening, and it's operational in NEON. And I think graduate students, undergrads, faculty are just incredibly lucky to be able to have that kind of resource. So to me, the surprise is how fast things are changing, and how exciting it is today, which is why I'm just so interested in seeing how it works out, because I think we're going to be in for some amazing discoveries in the years ahead.
Yeah, and that kind of makes me curious. The major differences that you've just discussed about the way that science used to be conducted and the way that it is now, and it has been, seem to be differences in scale, whether that be scales over time or the quantity of data that one has available, or, geographically, that if you're looking at continental scale science versus, small regional or site specific. Is that the major difference between the way that, science is being conducted now and the way that it was earlier in your career?
Well, I think our tools are so much more sophisticated at the micro end and at the macro end, that we're able to see things, that we could just not see before. But I think scale in biology has always been there. I mean, ever since people started thinking about extinction and biodiversity, it's a global phenomenon. What was happening in the Devonian or the Permian, these are planet-wide kinds of issues, dramatic kinds of changes in the biodiversity. So one of the advantages I guess I've had in my own career is having about a third of my work in geology, and understanding and long time scales really matter in understanding evolution. But we're also learning that short time scales also matter in evolution, and in some situations things can change very rapidly. So I think the pace of change is the main thing I think that we've experienced is quite fundamentally different. There was always an interest in microbiology, from the first microscope and Leeuwenhoek and all the kinds of amazing diversity that he was able to illustrate shows, I think an interest in that. But subcellular, what was going on in terms of mitochondria or aspects of what we now think of as genomics, that was just not possible. So the idea that the technology, I think on both ends, micro and macro, have just opened our eyes to so many things. And fortunately, we have a lot more people working and a lot more diversity in biology than we've ever had before, which I think is really significant in terms of leading to more innovation, because people view the world through many different lenses now, more so than what was happening, say, when Darwin and Wallace were discovering evolution and biodiversity. But the same interest, I think, in direct observation and curiosity still drives it. So that's what I like about still teaching, is that I can try to remind students that some fundamentals are the same, but wow, the changes have been remarkable and things are just changing so fast that this is a great time to be alive and to be curious about what's coming next.
Yeah, absolutely. And how would you say that professional societies have played a role in your career? Were there any particularly big events or large happenings that kind of had an effect there?
Absolutely. And I think, I have benefited so much from professional societies. In fact, one of the courses I team teach now at Georgia is careers in ecology, and emphasize students joining professional societies, student chapters, to start thinking about career paths, whether they change dramatically over the next 20, 30, 40, 50 years. That's not the issue. It's just jumping in and getting started. And I remember, I guess, the first AIBS meetings, the first AAAS meetings, the first ecology meetings, the first meetings I went to for ASLO, now the Association for Science of Limnology and Oceanography, Society for Freshwater Science, International Society for Ecology. All these are groups that over the years I've joined, and I think that I've benefited from enormously by being able to interact with people and get advice, and to understand that there are professional challenges, often ethical issues in science, where you need professional societies to help you grapple with, what is the right thing to do? Because an awful lot of things in biology, and certainly in ecology and evolution, are controversial. And policymakers and the public often don't understand the process, and groups like AIBS are essential in helping do that. So I think that the professional societies have always played an amazingly important role, and more so now than ever, because I think what we're experiencing right now with the pandemic is that a lot of people don't believe the science, don't understand the science, and it's really sad that we haven't done a better job. And I think it's opening our eyes to the fact that professional societies need to step up and redouble their efforts. And I know that that it's difficult, because these groups generally have a very small staff and rely a lot on volunteers and a lot on aspects of how do we do really big things with a small group of people. And so you start to learn about strategy and you learn about cooperation. And that's why these large groups like AAAS and AIBS in particular are so important in terms of integrating all these other societies. And I remember when I was president of AIBS, we were challenged with trying to get the presidents of all the member societies together for the President's Summit, and to establish some strategies for how do we move things ahead. And at that point, I think there were some like 70 different groups. I knew, if any reader of BioScience, like somewhere on page 4, there's a list of all these organizations and member societies. And if you look at that, you begin to see, my goodness, biology is extremely diverse. And this isn't all of biology. This is integrated biology. This is, there are a lot of other societies in terms of experimental biologists and so on and so forth that are also working effectively, I think, in Washington, D.C. to try to talk with staffers in particular, members of Congress, and trying to educate them. But there's turnover. There's turnover in terms of the staff. There's turnover in terms of congressional committees. And there's turnovers in terms of the professional societies. So that it's an ongoing, never-ending kind of challenge to make it clear that professional societies can represent a very large number of people, even though there's still a lot of disagreements about some fundamentals. There's an enormous agreement about some major points that need to be communicated effectively. So I don't know. I mean, ever since I was a graduate student, I think I've enjoyed reading BioScience, and I think AIBS does a fantastic job with that. I always look forward to it, and I think even this idea then of having an oral history and having people talk about their careers is really important, because AIBS from the very beginning, I think one of the things that was a highlight was non-traditional careers. And NSF was very anxious to understand how to diversify what professional biologists do. And I think it was always interesting to me that AIBS was right at the center of that, of showing how people could change. They might have a PhD in cell biology, but suddenly they decide, they want to be editor of BioScience, or they want to do something completely different. And that's still going on with our graduate students and our undergraduates. They're extremely diverse, more so now than ever before, because there are more opportunities than ever before. But somebody's got to keep, I think, reminding people that this is the right thing to do, that you don't have to make up your mind when you're 8 years old that you're going to do one thing and just keep doing it. You can be growing on the job, changing jobs. You have freedom to be really capable of being innovative and being capable of seeing things quite differently, and often being right, but also not being too concerned when you're wrong, because you know that you can come back and you've got some support from others who've been there or done the same kind of thing. So I don't know. I think professional societies to me have just been a major part of my life. And I think that at the international level, that's become really significant as well. I think the Ecological Society of America started out over 100 years now in terms of many of the members were from all over the world, because the ESA was just a second ecological society right after the British by 1 year. And the idea that we're facing global problems isn't new. We've been facing global problems for as long as people can remember. It's just now we can face them with more collaboration, more cooperation, and more technology. And now we just have to have the political will to make things happen. And in order to do that, we need to communicate why science is actually working for everybody, not just for a few people, as some, I think, people are suspicious that, oh, it's just another industry. All we're doing is worrying about grant support. And it's not that. It's curiosity. It's really trying to find out how things work and how they can work better and how we can value them in time to be useful before we lose a lot of this biodiversity that's actually contributing so much to ecosystem services and so much to our lives. And we have to get people to stop and think long term, not just about what's happening next week or next year, but over decades. And I think that's why the professional societies need to sustain themselves, need to be in business for a long time. And certainly AIBS has done that. I don't think people appreciate all that is done, or how hard it is to keep things going. But certainly so far it's working, and it just needs to keep working and keep working better and better and better.
Yeah, it sounds like there's a potential for achieving a kind of unity of vision or perspective that you wouldn't get in the absence of those sort of overarching organizations. But since you mentioned AIBS, do you have any particular favorite stories or striking memories from your time working with AIBS as president?
Well, the thing I think that I still am amazed about was that we had this incredible celebration in terms of the new millennium back in 2000, where we invited outstanding biologists to talk about not only what they'd done, but how they see the future. And that was just an incredible experience for me personally, and I think for anybody who attended that 2-day session. But seeing people that you had known about, read about, that maybe not had met recently, like Ernst Mayr, giving a talk at 95 about his perspectives on evolution and how he got started and how he got interested in biology. And what AIBS did was to interview each of the speakers, and some of those video recordings are still on YouTube, surprisingly enough. So people can go back and see what people were thinking in 2000 about what was going to happen in the next millennium. Well, 20 years later, some of those ideas are still really hot topics. And I think people like E.O. Wilson, Dan Jansen, Gillian Prance, Gordon Orions, Gene Likens, um, Gillian Prance, I guess a number of folks, I think Marvelly Wake, Lynn Margulis, these were people who viewed biology very differently. And I still remember how inspired that was and how well it worked because we were hosted by the Natural History Museum at the Smithsonian, and I think we were trying to make this happen with a very small budget, but people were very enthusiastic, and I think it was one of those things that was extremely effective at the time. And I think more of those kinds of historic events looking forward is what's needed because this is what students today are interested in. They want to know how they can contribute. And I keep reminding them that, science is people, and understanding something about the history of science is really critical for understanding what you can do next. But it's unlimited in terms of these kind of things. And having some high profile kinds of opportunities to highlight these things really do help. I know when I first moved to Georgia in 2003, I was teaching what we call the senior seminar, and Gene Odum had just recently passed away, and I got online and looked for something on Gene Odum that I could use in my seminar, and here was this video interview with Gene from 2000, from that New Millennium session, and he was just perfect. He was just saying exactly what Gene Odum always said about ecosystems, and the students loved it. The resolution is not as great as it is today in terms of videos, but it still, I think, captured the personality. It captured the independence, the drive, the thinking about how things can be done differently. And Gene always told the story that he wanted to write a book on fundamentals of ecology, and his department head in the zoology department said, "Well, there are no fundamentals. I don't know how you're going to write that textbook." Well, he managed to write it, and then 5 editions later, it was still very important. But I think those kinds of personal stories, and the favorite one that I got out of that video, and have since used many, many times in my own teaching, is that when Gene was growing up, he wanted to be a plumber. And when his family would go to dinner on Sundays at different people's homes, he would get under the house and start looking for where the pipes come and how things were connected. And people would wonder, where's Gene? Oh, he's exploring. Well, he was interested in flows. He was interested in connectivity. He called it plumbing, and then he later found out it's ecology and it's ecosystems. And he and his brother, H.T. Odum, and his father, who was a social scientist, that family had some amazing discussions, not only about plumbing, but about social sciences impacting on the environment and all the rest of it. And that came over in that interview in a way that I thought was extremely important for students to see. So I think the surprise is that professional societies do great things. Sometimes they're not fully appreciated because people are so busy. And I don't know what the answer to that is because, maybe now people spending more time at home and they have more time to explore for these kinds of things than they used to. I hope that continues. But certainly the role of communicating past in order to understand what's possible in the future is extremely important, more so than ever before, in my view. Obviously, it was probably always important, but certainly right now, it seems really important for science to be understood.
No, I couldn't agree more. And collecting many of those stories and perspectives has been, a very rewarding experience for me as well. Speaking of, perhaps one of those stories, what would you say is your best day on the job? It could have been perhaps one of the ones you just mentioned, or anything else.
I think the idea near the end of every semester when students have really learned a lot and are beginning to appreciate how things come together. Because I think week by week, sometimes they're struggling to put the pieces together. And biology and ecology requires integration, and it's not easy. So it takes a real effort. But when you see students smiling and feeling confident, and they do well on the final exam, I think, okay, I've done a good job. In terms of research, probably the best day of my life was the first night I discovered I needed to put on the face mask and go out with an underwater light and see what was happening in the lake in Yucatan, Mexico that I was studying. It was an absolute shock to see how many eyes were looking back at me that I hadn't seen during the day. That's why earlier I said this notion of what happens at night versus what happens in the day is just amazing. I will never forget that as long as I live, and I'm still doing that, doing nighttime video recording now in Brazil, because I think that what you see in terms of predator-prey interactions and foraging behavior and what happens in the dark, whether it's in a river or a lake or on land, is really fundamentally different at night. And my data are so much better after I put my first face mask on and my first underwater light that I just can't keep from telling people, make sure you do that. Yes, sampling has its problems no matter how you do it, but putting a net through the water is not the same as actually getting in the water and looking firsthand. And now with GoPro cameras and the way the cameras have developed for underwater work today is just astounding. And the fact that we can do red light, low light, and get some pretty good nighttime imagery is just amazing. But what you can see with your own eyes is still the best thing in the world. So I think those are the two best days of my life is the end of the semester and the beginning of my first nighttime studies.
No, that's interesting, and it reminds me of something. In my own life, I'm an avid hiker, and I enjoy night hiking quite a bit. And it always amazes me that people, just kind of hole up in their tents when the sun goes down, and I think they kind of miss out on some of the best part of the day. Of course, you have to watch your step a little bit.
Yeah, and the stars are amazing. When you get outside the city with all the light pollution and you see what the sky actually looks like, it's astounding. And moonlight, and when you see underwater on a moonlit night versus a night that's cloudy or there's no moon, it's a different ecosystem, and it's been that way ever since time. So there are a lot of physiological things that are determined by solar day lengths and day-night kind of things, but there's also species that evolve to lunar cycles. So all that just intrigues me no end. That I find it fascinating.
Absolutely. What would you say was your most challenging day on the job?
I think academic administration. I served 8.5 years, first as department head, and then as director at your Institute of Ecology when I first moved to Georgia. And I don't know, people talk about herding cats. I've never tried to herd cats, but trying to get faculty in a meeting to agree on something is really complicated because of this tradition, I think, of such independence that we've developed, and the fact that people have diverse opinions. But if you're talking about changing the curriculum or modifying things in some kind of way that you think is better, getting people to agree on it is really tough. And so I think I've learned on the job, but I think my first days and weeks being academic administrator were definitely challenging.
Do you find that aspect of the job rewarding, or just a necessary difficulty or evil?
No, it's absolutely rewarding. I wouldn't have done it for 8.5 years. I mean, the other half is because
Sure.
the person that was going to replace me didn't show up because he got to change his mind. But I think that trying to really build things that matter requires teamwork, and that requires leadership. And I began to appreciate leadership, all along, ever since being a Boy Scout, actually. But I think all through my career, it was clear that when good things happen, it's because some people rise to the occasion for really spending some time and part of their energy and creativity to make things work for others. So I think academic administration is a good thing. I never wanted to be a dean or a provost or any of those jobs. I respect anybody who will do that, but boy, that's another scale that I was never brave enough to tackle. But I think at the unit level, the departmental level, it's really great to be able to work with your colleagues and get agreement and make things happen and to see some progress. But I think you get better at it, and then you say, okay, I've learned those lessons, and now it's time for somebody else to jump in. So I think another best day of my life was when I stopped doing it because I was liberated to get back to full-time research and teaching. And so everything's a trade-off. But I think you have to make those trade-offs as you go and learn as you go and appreciate then how difficult some jobs are. So, I no longer complain when somebody has a different opinion from mine. I think, okay, well, I understand how that can be. And same with organizing programs. I mean, I was program chair for a number of things at AIBS and the Ecological Society and Society for Freshwater Science, Intercol. And now when I go to a meeting, I just enjoy the meeting so much more because I know how hard it is to make it work. And I know how lucky I am to have benefited from going to the meeting without having to actually be the program chair or participate in all the lead work that comes up to it. So I think you begin to appreciate how complicated some jobs are by actually doing them for a short period of time. And I've always had to limit myself that 10 years on any particular job was just about right. And then it was time to move on to the next phase or next something and give somebody else a chance.
Was your primary motivation in that to give someone else a chance, or was it to keep things fresh and, keep exposing yourself to, kind of new stimuli?
Well, that's, I think, two ways of saying the same thing. I think that you do get exhausted after a while in terms of dealing with some of the paperwork, which is really the downside of administration. And as far as I can tell, it hasn't gotten any better. But I think having some enthusiasm of people coming on to any job for the first time, asking questions that, well, why did we do it that way? Why didn't we do it this way? And actually, that was sort of how I got into it in the first place, because I can remember I was assistant chairman in zoology when I was at the University of Oklahoma. And as a faculty member, we had 3 annual reports to do. And I couldn't figure out, why do we have 3 to do when we only have 1 year? And it turned out, well, one was for the Dean of Arts and Sciences, one was for the department head, and one was for something that nobody else understood why we still had it, because nobody ever looked at it. And I thought, good Lord, we're wasting our time doing some of these kind of things. And that was opened my eyes to the fact that administration can get bogged down. And so you really need somebody to come in and shake things up and say, well, is this the best thing to do? And what are the trade-offs? How much time is this taking relative to how we could be investing our time in something more creative? So I think that definitely you need new eyes, you need new ideas. And I think that, as many people who can do that, I would say, probably 3 to 5 years is plenty.
That makes sense. And changing gears a little bit, if you could pick an event or aspect of your career that you would like to be long remembered into the future, what would that aspect be?
Oh, that's a hard one. I don't know. I think that the thing that I'm probably now most excited about, curious about, hoping that it will work, is this National Ecological Observatory Network that, as I mentioned before, AIBS had a major role in organizing workshops and communicating to the ecological community about how to do this kind of science. But it is so amazingly challenging and complex. I think Patel now recently is doing a good job, but I've been on several committees evaluating progress and seeing about just how complicated big science is. And doing continental scale science is definitely a challenge and something that hadn't been done before. So the idea of how to watch that develop is something that I really want to spend some time on as I get to my retirement phase of life, and seeing how this next generation uses that information and how policymakers use it. Because now it was designed to think about climate change. And I think it was well designed, but I think it has to continue to be evaluated in terms of, as we learn more about what climate change is doing and how to measure it, are we keeping up? I think the models are getting better and better, and the results are showing that things are happening faster than we might have first anticipated. But I can remember early on reading some amazing books about climate change before it was a topic. And I guess Rachel Carson was the first one back in 1951 talking about what was happening in the northern areas, about what wildlife were doing, what birds were doing. and in the sea around us, she was anticipating aspects of climate change. And that then coupled with aspects of pollution with Silent Spring, she was just amazingly insightful as a direct observer and a careful reader of what was happening. And if we could multiply that by thousands and millions of people thinking ahead and thinking about, what can we do now to make the world better, it would be really, really timely. So I don't know. I mean, I think that the other thing that I really wish I were better at is science writing. I'm thinking about taking some courses in retirement to learn how to write better, to communicate more widely. That's why I think what bioscience does is so important, and will continue to be forever. But I think that we really need to be more effective in communicating what we know is important and what we don't know yet, but we need to know. Because so many people think that research is done, and they don't understand that it's ongoing. And every time you answer one question, you've suggested 3 or 4 more that need to be answered. But there's certain books, certain things I think that catch people's eye, whether it's things like Darwin and the Origin of Species, or for me growing up, it was Marston Bates and The Forest and the Sea. And the idea of making an analogy between coral reefs and rainforest and biodiversity really got me excited at a time, when I was in college. And I just, reading a lot of what was then viewed as popular books, was something that I did routinely because one of my part-time jobs in college was on the weekend and Sundays. I managed the garden gate shop at the Missouri Botanical Garden, which had a small bookstore. And indeed, I could read some of those books and then refer people to them and say, have you seen this? And this is a really great book. But mostly I was just interested in reading as many as I could. And I think I'm still that way in terms of, I just find books that are written for non-specialists as being really critical. And I think we need more people integrating, we need more people doing it. And I'm so proud of some of our graduate students, some of our PhDs who are looking at that as a profession. And again, I say that, that's what AIBS has been fostering ever since I can remember, is making career goals that fit you and your personality and your goals and your interest in really making a change. So that I think even though I haven't done much of that, maybe none of that so far, most of my papers have been oriented towards peer-reviewed journals, but I would certainly like to write more things for a wider audience, and I hope I can do that.
Well, we'd hope so too, and we would look forward to those. What are you working on right now?
Well, 2 things I think are most immediate. The continuing work in Puerto Rico, looking at how things are continuing to change in terms of cumulative effects of this combination of hurricanes and droughts that I referred to earlier. Climate change is certainly hitting the rainforest. But got a Fulbright a few years ago after attending a conference in Rio de Janeiro in Brazil from the Brazilian Limnological Society, and got invited to collaborate with some colleagues in the Pantanal. And seeing the Pantanal for the first time and flying over it and then getting into the field is just so amazing. It's the world's largest wetland for good reason. It's the most diverse habitat I've ever seen. And so it has forest all around it. The watershed that drains into it is amazing. But when I first started reading about it years ago, I just could not understand how it could function as an ecosystem. And now I have a better idea how it functions, but I'm more worried about, will it be sustainable? Because, it's a 6 months dry season when a lot of things dry out and cattle are brought in and there's a lot of production. And then the rains start, and from north to south, there's a wave of water that is inundating this entire area. But some of the lakes are perched and aren't flooded. Some of the wetlands are flooded. The topography is so much more complex than I ever understood before. And as a consequence, with all that habitat diversity, you just get an amazing amount of biodiversity of all sorts, from everything from jaguars and big game anteaters and tapirs and so on, to all kinds of macroinvertebrates and microbes. So the Pantanal is something I wish I had discovered, years ago. to get a better handle on it. But I'm trying to keep up with that now. And one sad thing is that I wasn't able this last summer to go back because of the flights were all canceled to Brazil. But I'm counting on 2021 getting back into the field and looking at some of these food webs, which is fascinating.
Yeah, and I should ask, what is the field work like there? And, are you remote and distant, sleeping in a tent, on some little small swath of land in a large wetland, or is it, short trips out from a city center?
Well, I was actually really impressed with what the universities have done over the years. I mean, everybody understands about the Amazon, I think, and it's very diverse. And if you're studying the river as an ecosystem, you can operate off of a large ship, and Manaus and all the rest of it. The scientific infrastructure is amazing, and is internationally funded. I think people from all over the world study there and fund it. But the Pantanal is less well known, I think, for research relative to the Amazon. But the universities have field stations. The federal universities is just where a lot of the research is done. We don't have federal universities that I'm aware of in the U.S. We have state universities or private universities. They have federal universities and state universities and private universities, but a lot of the money that goes into research is funded, and at least in the past, though they've had some serious cuts recently, into some very significant infrastructure, and they've made enormous progress. I first went to Brazil back from the early UN discussion about the biodiversity treaty, and getting ready for that was a major effort, I think, global effort. And seeing how things developed after that have been amazing. Even though the US never signed that treaty, others have, and it had a huge impact on the Brazilian science structure. So that the facilities, the field stations, and a number of students who are working is just incredibly exciting. In fact, when I went to that first limnology meeting in Rio, I walked into this auditorium and I could not believe how many people were there and how many were under 25 or 30 years of age. So that the papers that were given and all of the work that was going on was just absolutely impressive and amazing. And the thing that I guess concerned me was that they read our papers, but we don't read all of theirs, and many of us don't read Portuguese. Theirs getting better and better in publishing in English. But I think throughout the world, Spanish and Portuguese is really becoming much more significant in terms of publication. When I was a student, we were required to read German and French or Russian. Now I think Spanish and Portuguese, at least for tropical work, is a real necessity. But I think that the field work is you can do it at any scale. You can certainly go out, with one or two people and camp out and spend some nighttime observation all by yourself, or you can go with groups. And the first time I went out, we had two vans full of people, and with the grad students and faculty, and they teach field courses in the Pantanal, which is just totally amazing. So they have an infrastructure that's set up to do that. But the other thing is that much of the Pantanal is privately owned. And so to get into some places, you need permission. And this is where it gets complicated. You really need the social network of the researchers who know the private landowners to be able to get permission to sample and study on their land. And that can complicate things in terms of access and how long you can stay. For example, last summer they were doing nighttime studies, but they wanted us off of their private land by 8:30 at night because they were concerned about aspects of accidents happening. There are jaguars and caimans and all kinds of things out there. And so they didn't want to take chances, but they understood that we needed nighttime data. But we couldn't stay all night. In other places, you could stay all night, but then the roads weren't very good, and so you could get stuck. So I think, like most field work, it's a challenge, but it's actually pretty simple in some places. Some areas are really open to ecotourism and have excellent facilities. I think so. It really runs an enormous range of possibilities. All of them great.
That sounds exciting. And this, may be informed by something you just said about the difference in the languages used. But if you were entering graduate school today, is there anything that you would study differently or do differently from when you did it the first time around?
No, absolutely. I mean, I did take French and German because those are required as a PhD at the time when I was a grad student. And so I started in high school with French. I would definitely do Spanish and Portuguese if I were starting today. I've learned some Spanish in the field, but I can't speak very fluently in Spanish. I can think of the present and the future, but my past tense verbs are terrible. So I really that's another thing I need to do in retirement is improve my language abilities just so I feel better about it. So many scientists, of course, today do speak English, and we're so lucky about that, especially the younger ones, and they're anxious to practice their English. So it works out. Communication is still there, but you feel like you're missing some of the jokes, certainly. You're missing some of the cultural richness if you don't really speak the language. Obviously, there's more computer sciences and more skills along those lines, which I wish I would have taken up as well all along the way. But again, fortunately, I've had great graduate students and colleagues to help. And indeed, in these days, it's a team effort. So I think it's been working. But yeah, I mean, looking back on it, there's certainly some things I would do differently if I were starting today.
And any advice for young scientists starting out in the field today?
Well, I think this is, what we're formalizing this now, say in these courses that we teach on our campus for career guidance. And I think we have career centers in ways that are working for biologists in much more diverse ways than when I was a student. It used to be, I guess about 95% of all freshmen said they wanted to be physicians. And so pre-med was dominating, and I think it still does in many areas, but there's much more diversity now in terms of getting good advice. And that certainly helps, but I think we've formalized it in coursework so that people get it when they need it, which is early on, so that we can start to advise freshmen now rather than waiting 2 years until they declare a major, as used to be the case. And that helps a lot. It doesn't mean that you don't change majors, because that's what I keep telling them. I changed 4 times. You can change as many times as you want, as long as you eventually graduate on time and pull things together in some new ways that work for you. And unfortunately, universities are pretty flexible these days, and that helps a lot. But I think that from the standpoint of advice is to be persistent. Don't give up. If the first thing doesn't work, stay at it. I mean, Lord knows that's my only skill set is persistence. I think that you're always going to find some opportunities, and you grab them. That was one thing that G.E. Hutchinson emphasized in terms of his students, was that when you see something that's unique and really interesting, grab it, make the most of it, don't let go. He would tell a story of some things that he saw that he didn't follow up on that he regretted. Of course, he saw so many things that he did follow up on that it was hard for us to imagine that was really a problem for him. But he did emphasize that some things you really have to jump on immediately. Some things can wait. And making those distinctions between what you do in a timely manner and how you use your time effectively is something that is really hard to learn when you're starting out. And I think that a lot of times people are more concerned about what I would call efficiency rather than creativity. And sometimes creativity is pretty messy, but it is also a question of how timely is it? Are you there at the right time in the right place to see something that nobody else has seen, or to appreciate it in a context that nobody else has been able to do because your background was different? And so being overly concerned about what we call the program of study and making sure that you have the prerequisites and all the kind of things that academics generally focus on is one set of concerns, but usually those work out one way or the other, and you can always patch things together if you need to. But the fact is that timeliness and persistence and curiosity really work. I think you've seen that in some of the other kind of discussions that AIBS has had. I saw online there was a number of career guidance kinds of things, and I remember Joe Travis having some wonderful things to say. Others on that series, Pamela Solstice at the University Museum in Florida. Others, I mean, I would seek out as many different kinds of suggestions as possible, and today that's easier to do than ever. I really, when I look back on it, I was amazing how uninformed I was about so many things um, when I was just starting out in college. And yet it worked. And that's what I keep reminding students of in these classes that I teach today is that you're going to be just surprised when you look back 10 years later about how many things happened that you didn't expect to happen. Get over worrying about being, too much in charge. Take advantage of opportunities as they come along. I think that was Ernst Mayer's big advice when we interviewed him back in 2000 at age 95. And he gave some examples in his own career about how he wanted to be a physician because his father and his grandfather was a medical doctor. And so it was assumed that he would be until he went on a voyage to New Guinea and discovered aspects of biodiversity of ornithology and then other kinds of things that he suddenly realized he wanted to be a biologist, not a medical doctor. And I think that, we need good doctors. I certainly favor of that. But I think that we also need people to follow their own pathways. And fortunately today, it's easier to do in some ways, but more complicated because there are more pathways. And so I really understand how frustrating it can be for students. And I just say, jump in, do what you can, learn as you go, and be persistent.
I think that's excellent advice and a great parting shot as well. Dr. Covich, thank you very much for joining me today.
My pleasure. Thank you for doing all this.
And that concludes this episode of BioScience Talks. Just a reminder, the journal BioScience is published by Oxford University Press on behalf of the American Institute of Biological Sciences and is made possible by the support of our members and donors. Thank you, and talk to you next time.